Samstapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Om Srimate Ramanujaya namaha. When we hear the word Vedanta, normally we think of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, Sri Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedanta. That's the most popular school of Vedanta, we can say. But in fact, there are many schools of Vedanta, and I want to discuss today Ramanuja's Bhakti school of Vedanta. The name of his school is Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, qualified non-dualism. Most of us don't know much about the non-Advaitic schools of Vedanta. That's why I wanted to focus on Sri Ramanuja's philosophy of Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, and I wanted to focus on three things, because most of you are devotees, disciples in the tradition of Sri Ramakrishna. I wanted to focus on three things. First of all, what are the basics of Sri Ramanuja's philosophy? The main doctrines. Number two, what can we learn as sadhakas from Ramanuja's teachings? And third, what are the similarities and differences between Sri Ramanuja's philosophy and Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? These are the three things I wanted to discuss briefly. Of course, Sri Ramanuja's philosophy is very sophisticated, very detailed, very complex in some places. So I'm not going to discuss many of these complexities. I'll just give some of the basic doctrines and then compare his views with Sri Ramakrishna's. So the first thing to keep in mind is, most of you have read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna in some language, whether Bangla or English or Kannada, and you'll find that Sri Ramakrishna mentions Ramanuja in many, many places. Sri Ramakrishna had great reverence for Ramanuja's philosophy and for Ramanuja as a great God-realized soul and as an acharya. And for instance, so on March 11th, 1885, this is recorded in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna says, Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is true, and so is the Vishishta Advaita Vedanta of Ramanuja. Now notice that here, Sri Ramakrishna does not say that Vishishta Advaita is a stepping stone toward Advaita Vedanta, or that it's a lower stage on the way to Advaita Vedanta. He puts them on an equal footing. That's very important, because what happens, many of us as devotees of the Ramakrishna tradition, we tend to think that Dvaita and Vishishta Advaita are stepping stones toward Advaita Vedanta, but Advaita Vedanta is the highest. But I find when I study the Gospel that Sri Ramakrishna does not say that. He doesn't have this hierarchy. He doesn't say Bhakti is lower than Advaita. He puts them on an equal footing. Now, what are some of the main doctrines of Ramanuja's philosophy? First of all, what is the nature of ultimate reality? What is the nature of Brahman? According to Ramanuja, Brahman is only personal. And by personal, it doesn't mean that he's a person in the sense that I'm a person. What he means is, he is the loving, personal God with omni-attributes. This is a technical term used in philosophy of religion. Omni-attributes means God is omniscient, God is omnipotent, God is all-loving, God is the creator of this universe, the preserver of the universe, the destroyer of the universe. In this sense, he is the supreme person. Ramanuja calls Brahman Vishnu Narayana. Okay? So in this is Ramanuja's understanding of Brahman. He does not, what's very important to keep in mind is, unlike Shankaracharya, Ramanuja does not accept at all the reality of Nirguna Brahman. So there's a very clear contrast between Shankaracharya and Ramanuja. According to Shankaracharya, the ultimate reality, Brahman, is only Nirguna, only impersonal, attributeless. And according to Ramanuja, Brahman it's just the opposite. Brahman is only Saguna, personal, the personal loving God with omni-attributes. Now, it's on this point that if we ask ourselves, well, how do we compare Ramanuja with Sri Ramakrishna? And I think this is the most important point of difference. I'll discuss both similarities and differences, but the most important point of difference between Ramanuja's philosophy and Ramakrishna's philosophy is that according to Sri Ramakrishna, the ultimate reality is both Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman. He calls Nirguna Brahman Brahman, and he calls Saguna Brahman Shakti. And one of his most famous teachings is Brahmo o Shakti Abhed in Bengali. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. They are just different aspects, but equally real aspects of the same divine reality. So neither Shankaracharya nor Sri Ramanuja accepts this very broad view of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna, in a sense, harmonizes the standpoints of Sri Shankaracharya and Sri Ramanuja by accepting both the Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Shakti. So this is the one thing to keep in mind, is that Sri Ramakrishna accepts many aspects of Sri Ramanuja's philosophy, but not all of them. And one thing that he disagrees with is Ramanuja says that Brahman is only personal, and Sri Ramakrishna will always say the ultimate reality is both personal and impersonal. He has a broader conception of God. Now, the next question is, why is Ramanuja's philosophy called Vishishtadvaita Vedanta? That's the next question. Vishishtadvaita means qualified non-dualism. So the question is, what is Brahman qualified by? According to Sri Ramanuja, Brahman is qualified by Chit and Achit. So Chit, Achit, Vishishta, Brahma. Chit means the jivas, the conscious individual souls. Each one of us has a different jiva, according to Sri Ramanuja. And Achit means everything that's insentient in this world, all insentient entities. This table, the chair, right, the floor. So according to Ramanuja, both jiva and jagat are parts of God. They can be considered, sometimes he uses the language of sharira. He considers jiva and jagat to be the sharira, the body of God. But they're parts of God. This is the main idea behind Ramanuja's doctrine. So Ramanuja's Advaita, we can say, he's also an Advaitic philosopher. That's why his philosophy is called Vishishta Advaita. He's an Advaitin philosopher, but his Advaita is what we can call an all-inclusive Advaita. This is an Advaita which includes Brahman, and Brahman includes the universe and all living beings. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Now, on the same day, March 11th, 1885, when Sri Ramakrishna talks about Ramanuja, Swami Vivekananda, the young Narendranath, he was there. He was visiting Sri Ramakrishna, and the moment that Sri Ramakrishna mentioned Ramanuja's name, Swamiji, Narendranath, he asked Sri Ramakrishna, he said, what is Vishishtadvaita? And then Sri Ramakrishna gives Swamiji a direct answer. It's a very long answer, and we should listen to it very carefully, because you'll see that Sri Ramakrishna had a very beautiful understanding of Ramanuja's philosophy. Sri Ramakrishna said, Vishishtadvaita is the theory of Ramanuja. According to this theory, Brahman, or the Absolute, is qualified by the universe and its living beings. These three, Brahman, the world, and living beings, Brahman, Jiva, and Jagat, together constitute one. Take the instance of a bale fruit. A man wanted to know the weight of the fruit. He separated the shell, the flesh, and the seeds. But can a man get the weight by weighing only the flesh? He must weigh flesh, shell, and seeds together. At first it appears that the real thing in the fruit is the flesh, and not its seeds or shell. Then by reasoning you find that the shell, seeds, and flesh all belong to the fruit. The shell and seeds belong to the same thing that the flesh belongs to. Likewise, in spiritual discrimination, one must first reason following the method of neti, neti, not this, not this. God is not the universe. God is not the living beings. Brahman alone is real and all else is unreal. Brahma satyam jagat mithya. Then one realizes, Sri Ramakrishna is saying, then one realizes, as with the bale fruit, that the reality from which we derive the notion of Brahman is the very reality that evolves the idea of living beings and the universe, Jiva and Jagat. The Nitya and the Lila are the two aspects of one and the same reality. Therefore, according to Ramanuja, Brahman is qualified by the universe and the living beings. This is the theory of Vishishtadvaita. So this is Sri Ramakrishna's beautiful explanation of Ramanuja's philosophy. He gives a nice summary, exactly what I just told you, that according to Sri Ramanuja, Brahman is qualified by both Jiva and Jagat. Jiva and Jagat are parts of God. And they're real. Jiva and Jagat are also real. Now, what's even more interesting about Sri Ramakrishna's explanation of Ramanuja's philosophy is that if you study the gospel, you'll find that in many places in the gospel, Sri Ramakrishna distinguishes two stages in spiritual experience, which he calls Gyana and Vijnana. And here, in the passage that I just read, he says the Gyani is the person who practices neti neti vichara. He says Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Ultimately, he attains Nirguna Brahman, the realization of the non-dual Nirguna Brahman, in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Sri Ramakrishna sometimes will use the example of a staircase. So you climb up the stairs, and the Gyani is the person who has reached the roof. He has attained Nirvikalpa Samadhi. However, Sri Ramakrishna then says, Jnana is not the highest, it's not the last spiritual realization. He says, Gyan pore Bigyan in Bengali. After Jnana, there's an even greater state of spiritual realization, which is called Vijnana. And the interesting thing is, he claims that Ramanuja's philosophy comes closest to what he calls the outlook of the Vijnani. What is the difference between the Gyani's outlook and the Vijnani's outlook? Sri Ramakrishna says, the Gyani, who has realized the impersonal Nirguna Brahman, he looks upon this world as unreal, as a dream. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. But according to Sri Ramakrishna, the Vijnani sees that everything in this world is also God. Because Brahman is both Nirguna and Saguna, and everything in this world is nothing but different manifestations of Shakti, of the Divine Mother. So this is the Vijnani's realization. And he says that Vijnana comes after Jnana. And so what Sri Ramakrishna says in this passage, this quotation that I just read to you, he says that Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedanta corresponds to the spiritual stage of Jnana, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. But that Sri Ramanuja's philosophy corresponds to the greater stage of Vijnana, which is that's why, interestingly, the analogy that Sri Ramakrishna uses here to explain Ramanuja's philosophy, the bale fruit. If you want to know the weight of the bale fruit, you don't just take the flesh. You have to also weigh the seeds in the shell, the outside. If you look at other places in the gospel, when Sri Ramakrishna is explaining the realization of the Vijnani, he uses the same metaphor of the bale fruit. Why does he do that? Because I think that Sri Ramakrishna thinks that Ramanuja's philosophy comes closest to his own realization of Vijnana. And this analogy of the bale fruit actually led Mohandanatha Gupta, who is the author of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, the Kathamrita, to assume that Sri Ramakrishna followed Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita philosophy. And this is very interesting. If you've studied the English translation of the Kathamrita, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, this passage in the Gospel is not there at all. Swami Medhanandaji, who is the English translator, he didn't include this passage. But if you know Bangla and you read the original Bangla Kathamrita, it's there in the original. I will just read to you my translation of what Mohandanatha Gupta himself says about Sri Ramakrishna. So Mohandanatha Gupta says, Thakur Sri Ramakrishna does not say that this universe is unreal like a dream. He says, if we say so, then the weight of the bale fruit will fall short. His view, Sri Ramakrishna's view, is not the doctrine of Maya, but the doctrine of Vishishtadvaita. So this is a statement made by the author of the Gospel himself. It's of course a very controversial statement. In my opinion, Mohandanatha Gupta, he's right to see that there are very deep similarities or parallels between Ramanuja's philosophy and Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana, but I think he's not correct in thinking that they're the same. Remember what I said earlier, which is that the one main difference between Ramanuja's philosophy of Vishishtadvaita and Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana is that Ramanuja does not accept the reality of Nirguna Brahman. It's not a part of his philosophy at all. Whereas Sri Ramakrishna accepts the reality of Nirguna Brahman as well. So this is the key difference. At the same time, Mohandanatha Gupta, he's correct in thinking that there is a very similar idea in both Ramanuja and Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. What is that similar idea? The idea of the bale fruit. That you cannot say that only Brahman is real and that Jiva and Jagat are unreal. Jiva and Jagat are part of Brahman. The whole Jiva, Jagat, Brahman, all of this is one divine reality. This is the deep similarity between Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Ramanuja. Now, with regard to spiritual practice, this is the next big issue. Any philosophy, any school of Vedanta has to explain the different spiritual practices. What is Ramanuja's view about spiritual practice? What Ramanuja says is, I'll first give a very brief overview and then explain in a little bit more detail. Basically, what Ramanuja says is that sadhakas, in the beginning, they should practice karma yoga and jnana yoga together in order to purify their minds. And then once they have pure minds and once they attain a certain spiritual level, then they can practice bhakti yoga. And through bhakti yoga, they can attain the goal of life, which is God realization. So this is the overall scheme. Now, we have to understand in more detail, what does Ramanuja mean by karma yoga? What does he mean by jnana yoga? And what does he mean by bhakti yoga? So let's discuss that briefly. Karma yoga, most of you should know this if you've studied the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita. Karma yoga means whatever you do it as an offering to the Lord, to God, to Vishnu, Narayana, to Krishna. And by doing that, whatever work we do becomes a kind of worship. And we thereby purify our minds. So Ramanuja says that it's absolutely essential to practice karma yoga in the beginning of our spiritual lives. At the same time, he said that we should practice jnana yoga. Now, one thing that you should keep in mind is different Vedanta acharyas, Madhva, Ramanuja, Shankaracharya, many other acharyas, they don't necessarily mean the same thing by jnana yoga. What Shankaracharya means by jnana yoga is not the same thing that Ramanuja means by jnana yoga. So what does Ramanuja mean by jnana yoga? What he means is, jnana yoga is you should meditate on your true nature as an eternal individual soul, the Jivatma, which is separate from the body-mind complex. According to Ramanuja, we are in ignorance. We are ignorant of the fact that we are actually eternal souls, and instead we identify mistakenly with this physical body and with our minds. So through the practice of karma yoga and jnana yoga, eventually we should realize our true identity, our true nature as an eternal divine soul, which is a part of God. This is also very important. According to Sri Ramanuja, as souls, we are parts of God. We are amshas of God. This is a term that he uses very frequently, amsha. And God is the amshi. He is the whole, and we are all parts of God. So, through the combined practice of karma yoga and jnana yoga, we should attain what Sri Ramanuja calls atma avalokanam. We should realize ourselves as the eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. Only then, only after we realize our true eternal spiritual nature as the Jivatma, can we practice bhakti yoga. And what does he mean by bhakti yoga? He says that bhakti yoga is constantly thinking of God, constantly meditating on God, like an unbroken flow of oil. This is the way that Sri Ramanuja puts it. And finally, through the practice of bhakti yoga, we can realize God, which is the highest goal of life. But the important thing to keep in mind here, there's something very profound here and very practical in Ramanuja's teachings on spiritual practice. And to bring out what's practical about it, he has a beautiful statement. He says this in one of his most accessible texts. The text is called Vedartha Sangraha. It's a short text explaining Vishishtadvaita philosophy in a very simple way. There, Ramanuja makes a very beautiful statement. He says, Atmabhimano yadrishaha tad anugunaiva purushatta pratitihi. The English translation is, one's values and aims in life are determined by how one looks upon oneself. So this is a very practical teaching. Sri Ramanuja, what he's saying is, so long as we identify with the physical body, we will always be chasing after sense pleasures, bodily enjoyments, physical enjoyments. So long as if we identify with our minds, we will seek after intellectual pleasures, intellectual enjoyments, mental pleasures. When we identify with our eternal, our deeper soul, when we identify with the Jivatma, our spiritual nature, then we will only want spiritual things. We will only want God. This is a very profound idea. The idea is that most of us don't want God now. And the reason is because we identify with the body and the mind. So the first step in spiritual life is to realize our eternal divine nature as the eternal soul, the Jivatma. Because the Jivatma, as souls, we are already bhaktas. We are already children of God. We already seek God. So once we realize ourselves as souls, as an eternal soul, we will automatically have bhakti toward Ishvara, toward God. Now, Sri Ramakrishna says exactly the same thing. And I'll read to you a statement that Sri Ramakrishna makes. This is from the June 8th, 1883 entry from the Gospel. Sri Ramakrishna says, with ordinary people, the mind dwells in the three lower planes, at the organs of evacuation and generation and at the navel. When the mind ascends to the fourth plane, the center designated in yoga as anahata, which is the heart center, it sees the individual soul, the Jivatma, as a flame. Besides, it sees light. Jyoti darshan hoy is in the original Bengali, Jyoti darshana. At this, the aspirant cries, what is this? What is this? So Sri Ramakrishna says that the first spiritual realization that the sadhaka has after renouncing worldly pleasures is the realization of himself or herself as the internal Jivatma, separate from the body-mind complex. This is exactly what Sri Ramanuja is also saying. And both of them agree that in order to feel true bhakti, a genuine vyakulata, a genuine longing for God, we first have to realize our divine natures as the Jivatma. And even Swami Vivekananda, he says something very similar. One time, a disciple asked Swamiji Vivekananda, he asked him, how can one have bhakti? And Swami Vivekananda answers as follows. Vivekananda says, there is bhakti within you, only a veil of lust and wealth, kamini kanchana, covers it. And as soon as that is removed, bhakti will manifest by itself. It seems to me just a different way of putting the same thing that Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Ramanuja are also saying. The idea is, each of us is already a bhakta. But we don't know that we're bhaktas because we're identifying falsely with the body and with the mind. But the moment that we purify our minds and realize that we are divine souls, we will automatically have bhakti for God. So Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ramanuja, and Swami Vivekananda all are teaching the same thing in this regard. And yes, so this is Sri Ramanuja's overall scheme of spiritual practices. Now, we might ask, how does this compare with Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of spiritual practice? Remember, I'll just remind you one more time, according to Sri Ramanuja, we should begin by combining the practices of Karma Yoga and Gyani Yoga in order to purify our minds and to realize our true nature as the Jivatma, as the eternal divine soul, which is a portion of God. And then we are eligible to practice Bhakti Yoga, which is a higher spiritual practice. It's the highest spiritual practice. And then by constantly thinking of God, we ultimately realize God, which is the highest goal of life. We attain moksha, liberation. Now, according to Sri Ramakrishna, he does not say that bhakti is a higher practice than Gyani Yoga or Karma Yoga. He places them on an equal footing. This is another place where I think Sri Ramakrishna deviates slightly from Sri Ramanuja and even from Sri Shankaracharya. Sri Ramakrishna says that if you follow Karma Yoga, you can also reach the highest goal. If you follow Gyani Yoga, Shankara's Gyani Yoga, you can also reach the highest goal. And if you practice Bhakti Yoga, you can also reach the highest goal. If you practice Raja Yoga, Patanjali's Yoga, you can also attain the same goal. So Sri Ramakrishna does not have a hierarchy of spiritual practices, whereas both Sri Shankaracharya and Sri Ramanuja, they put one type of yoga above the other yogas. According to Sri Shankaracharya, Gyana Yoga is the highest yoga. According to Sri Ramanuja, Bhakti Yoga is the highest yoga. Sri Ramakrishna does not go into this higher lower thing. He says that whatever path you like, you follow it, and that will take you directly to God. Okay. And I wanted to point out a few more important differences between Sri Ramanuja and Sri Ramakrishna. What about Jeevan Mukti? We know, if we've studied the gospel, that Sri Ramakrishna fully accepts Jeevan Mukti. He says in many places, Sri Ramakrishna, that the Jeevan Mukta is the person who realizes directly, as a spiritual experience, that God alone is the doer. So Sri Ramakrishna accepts Jeevan Mukti. What's interesting about Sri Ramanuja is that he does not accept the possibility of Jeevan Mukti. He does not accept the possibility that we can be liberated while still in this physical body. So this is one difference. Why does Sri Ramanuja not believe that? Because what Sri Ramanuja says, he says, we can attain God realization. We can have the highest spiritual realization of God. But that's not the same thing as full liberation. Because according to Sri Ramanuja, even after we attain God realization in this physical body, we have to exhaust our prarabdha karma, whatever is remaining. And when we leave the physical body, when we finally die, our eternal soul will go to Vishnu Loka, this higher transcendental Loka, where we can dwell finally. It's only then, when we arrive at Vishnu Loka, that we attain full liberation. Because it's then that we, as jivas, as eternal souls, we dwell eternally in a loving relationship with Sri Vishnu, Vishnu Narayana. So liberation for Ramanuja means dwelling in Vishnu Loka as liberated souls. And this only happens after we leave the physical body. Now, how does this compare with Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of salvation? This is another important issue. Sri Ramakrishna fully accepts Ramanuja's ideal of salvation, the ideal of bhaktas. What Sri Ramakrishna would say in his simple way is, bhaktas do not want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. Chini hote chai na, chini khete chai. Right? But, so what he means, so in one place, for instance, in the Gospel, 23rd May, 1885, a follower of Advaita Vedanta, Mohima Chakraborty, he asked Sri Ramakrishna a question directly. He says, I have a question to ask, sir. A bhakta needs Advaitic nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? So this Advaitan, he's hoping that Sri Ramakrishna will tell him, yes, even bhaktas will ultimately have to reach this Advaitic state. But Sri Ramakrishna says no. So I'll just read Sri Ramakrishna's answer to Mohima. Sri Ramakrishna says, it cannot be said that bhaktas need Advaitic nirvana. There is a state in which the eternal Krishna is with his eternal bhaktas. Nitya Krishna tar nitya bhakto. There is a state like Ramanuja's Vishnu Loka or the Vraja Loka of Vaishnavas where there's Nitya Krishna and Nitya Bhakta. Sri Ramakrishna says, Krishna is spirit embodied and his abode also is spirit embodied. Chinmaya Shyama, Chinmaya Dhama. This is exactly the description that Ramanuja gives of this Vishnu Loka and the description that Vaishnavas give of Vraja Loka, this higher transcendental Loka. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, Krishna is eternal and the bhaktas also are eternal. Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta. So it's very clear that Sri Ramakrishna fully accepts the bhakta's ideal of salvation, which is going to this higher Loka. At the same time, where Sri Ramakrishna deviates from Sri Ramanuja is that Sri Ramakrishna also fully accepts the ideal of Advaita Vedanta. He says that Advaitans, they don't want to eat sugar, they want to become sugar. And Sri Ramakrishna says that's also perfectly fine. And the Advaitic ideal of merging your individuality in the non-dual, impersonal Brahman, it's just as valuable, just as good as the Bhakta's goal of eating sugar, of dwelling in a higher Loka with the personal God. So he accepts fully both forms of salvation, the Bhakta's goal of residing with the personal God for an eternity, and the Advaitan's goal of merging your individuality in non-dual Brahman. He accepts both equally. And it's a matter of choice, individual temperament, individual choice. After you attain liberation, you can choose whether to dwell in this Vishnu Loka, Vraja Loka, Ramakrishna Loka. Some of the bhaktas of Sri Ramakrishna, they want to dwell in Ramakrishna Loka. So they can have that form of salvation. And Advaitans can merge their individuality in non-dual Brahman. And finally, I wanted to mention one more wonderful doctrine of Sri Ramanuja's, which is very, very similar to something taught by Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother Sharada Devi. This is the doctrine of what Sri Ramanuja calls Archavatara. The idea is that, of course, Ramanuja believes that God himself can come in the form of human beings, in the form of Rama and Krishna and other avatars. But Sri Ramanuja goes further, and he says there's another type of avatara. There's an avatara in the form of the consecrated image, like the consecrated image of Holy Mother Sharada Devi, the consecrated image of Sri Ramakrishna. Ramanuja says that God himself is actually present in the consecrated image of God. This is a very profound idea. The idea is that when we are doing puja, we shouldn't think that we're doing puja in front of a picture. We're doing puja in the very presence of God. This is what Ramanuja means by Archavatara. Archa means the image or the murti, the pratima of God. the Vigraha of God. That Vigraha itself is a kind of avatara. It's an actual incarnation or manifestation of God. Sri Ramakrishna says the same thing. In February 1882, when Mohananath Gupta, the author of the Gospel, in his second visit to Sri Ramakrishna, Mohananath Gupta at the time, he was a slightly egoistic, and he was a follower of Brahma Samaj. And the Brahma Samaj did not accept the forms of God. They didn't believe in idol worship. So Mohananath Gupta tells Sri Ramakrishna, I don't like to think of God as having form. I like to think of God as formless. Then Sri Ramakrishna says to Gupta, he says, very good. It is enough to have faith in either aspect. You believe in God without form, that is quite all right. But never for a moment think that this alone is true and all else false. Remember that God with form, sakara, is just as true as God without form, nirakara. But hold fast to your own conviction. Then Mohananath Gupta says, sir, suppose one believes in God with form. Certainly he is not the clay image. Matir Pratima in Bengali. Mohananath Gupta, as a Brahma Samaj follower, he says, but of course, this image that bhaktas, that they worship, that cannot be God. This is what Gupta says. And then Sri Ramakrishna, he gets irritated, interrupting. Sri Ramakrishna says, but why clay? It is a manifestation of divine consciousness. In Bangla, he says, Mati kenogo, chinmayi pratima. Chinmayi pratima. He says, why are you thinking of the divine image as clay, as a mere picture? Chinmayi pratima means the picture itself is a manifestation. It's the actual presence of divine consciousness. So Sri Ramakrishna fully agrees with Sri Ramanuja in this doctrine of Archavatara, the idea that the consecrated divine image that you find in any temple, Jagannath, Tirupati, in our ashramas, these are living manifestations of God. And what does Holy Mother say about this? One time in a conversation with Swami Arupananda, Arupananda was a monastic, I believe a disciple of Holy Mother, they had a conversation on October 29th, 1910. And Arupanandaji asks Holy Mother, is Sri Ramakrishna really present in his picture? Like we have a picture here of Sri Ramakrishna. And then Holy Mother says, of course he is. A person's body and its shadow are equivalent. This picture of Sri Ramakrishna is his shadow. In Bangla, chaya kaya shaman, chobi to tar chaya. And then Arupanandaji asks, is Sri Ramakrishna present in all pictures of him? And then Holy Mother says, yes, as one goes on calling on him with yearning and devotion in his picture, he actually manifests in that picture. These are Holy Mother Sharada Devi's exact words. So you'll find that both that Sri Ramanuja, Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Sharada Devi are all teaching the same idea of Archavatara, the idea that God is actually present in the consecrated divine image that we worship on a daily basis. And so I wanted to end. Of course, there are some subtle philosophical differences between Ramanuja's philosophy and Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, as I already pointed out. But I wanted to end by emphasizing the commonalities. Sri Ramanujacharya, his fundamental teaching is that bhakti is a royal road to the highest goal of life, which is God realization. Don't think that Bhakti Yoga is some lower practice that's only practiced by people with impure minds, people who are manda adhikaris, inferior spiritual aspirants. It's not like that. Ramanuja says Bhakti Yoga itself is the royal road to salvation. And Sri Ramakrishna teaches exactly the same thing. And if you're interested in learning more about Sri Ramanuja's life and teachings, I would recommend a nice book written by Swami Tapasanandaji, a former vice president of the Ramakrishna order. He wrote a book called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta, and he has a nice long chapter, over 100 pages, first explaining Sri Ramanuja's life. He had a beautiful life story, and also his philosophy in a lot of detail. And if you want to directly study Sri Ramanuja's own writings, I would recommend that you start with a small text. I've already mentioned it. It's one of his more simple texts, Vedartha Sangraha. And the Chennai Mutt has published an English translation of Vedartha Sangraha. You can purchase that very cheaply. Let us pray to the holy trio, Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Sharada Devi, and Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Ramanujacharya, another great philosopher of bhakti. that we may grow in bhakti and vairagya and realize God in this very life. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.